Concord Players are putting on a production of She Kills Monsters in Concord, Massachusetts, running from November 7th through the 22nd. She Kills Monsters is a play about a woman coming to terms with tragedy through 2nd edition D&D. It'll tug at your heartstrings and be rad as the nine hells. For more information and to purchase tickets, check out their website at concordplayers.org.
Welcome to the Game Masters Book Club, where great fiction becomes your next great tabletop role-playing experience. In this episode, Alex Jackl, Ian Eller, and Sean Murphy scout out the gaming potential of Jeff VanderMeer's Borne, where human and not-so-human characters come together in morally tangled relationships of dependence, deception, and destruction, all against the backdrop of a post-ecological disaster dystopia populated with biotech horrors. During this discussion, we move through topics ranging from can the Game Master be an unreliable narrator, the use of factions and intrapersonal conflict in your gaming party, and our opinion that Jeff VanderMeer is most certainly a tabletop role player. Let's get into the conversation.
All right, everybody, welcome to another episode of the Game Masters Book Club, where we talk about awesome books. And this week we're going to be talking about Borne by Jeff VanderMeer, a fantastic sci-fi book. But before we get into that, we've got three great Game Masters returning again to talk to us about their reading experience and also about their gaming experience. And given the book, Borne, and its many factions within the story, we're going to have our Game Masters talk about multiple antagonists, intra-party conflict, where we've got lots of different groups working in their campaign. So we're going to start with Ian. Ian, are you ready to talk about games and intra-party conflict?
I believe that I can handle this discussion.
Excellent. You may proceed, sir.
Oh, we're going to do that part now. I see. Here's the thing that I think that is super important when we're discussing about how factions work in RPGs. And I believe that the best way to put this is to say that factions are the way that the GM communicates to the players how their actions are changing or not changing the face of the world. When we create a campaign, what we often do is we drop the players into the middle of it and we ask them to do stuff. And what sometimes we fail at is telling them what impact their choices had. Faction play is the easiest way to show them how that works and what their choices change, right? And so when you have two powerful factions working against each other and the players aren't necessarily working for one or both of those, but they are doing things in the game that change the landscape, those factions have to change their decisions. That is a reward for the PCs in order to continue to engage in the game. Like the fact that the Thieves Guild and the Assassins Guild are now at tension because the players were the ones that took out the head of the Merchants Guild, just as something off the top of my head, is a way to make that world alive and encourage the players to continue to act in the world, not just react to the world.
Sean, do you want to add to what Ian's saying here?
Yeah, I'm going to disagree in some way by offering a specific example, which is what we're supposed to be doing, is an example in play, not a lecture series. But that's Ian, so, we'll move on. I had a campaign running where it was a Call of Cthulhu campaign. They were investigating into strange events. There was a faction of cultists running around, but they were super personable cultists. They were like, we can give you money, we can give you power. If we pull this off, we're going to be in charge of everything. Don't you want that? And then another group of cultists were like, we want to stop them. And by the way, we don't care how many people die to make that happen. And so their actions didn't change. I mean, there was some reaction from them as they did it, but their action, they mostly had to pick which side they were more in favor of, which leads to those, inter-party discussions over what the important thing is. And, it worked well in this game. And, sometimes D&D, it works well where you have situations where someone says, hey, have you tried not killing everybody and then taking the money, but tried something else? And offered a different perspective on what it is the PCs could be doing with their time.
Excellent counterpoint. Alex, would you care to comment on your colleague's statements?
I actually think there's something to both. Remarkably, I actually mostly agree with both of them. So let's mark that down in the history books on the calendar. I do think, though, there's an opportunity, particularly to mix how faction play happens. Because in this particular story, right, you have people that are ostensibly part of, say, the magician's crew, who are, these mutated kids and weird things, but they actually occur as a random encounter most of the time. Only an emergent piece of information that these people are actually part of a faction rather than just a random encounter that you get in the city or some environmental effect of the city. And that, I think, in some ways, that's true too of the bears, all those things. And so I think an opportunity is to create something that's complex enough that factions can emerge. I think that Sean was pointing at of actually having there be parts of the faction that are actually quite possibly appealing to the player characters and some that are not appealing, forcing them to make difficult choices. Like, oh my God, they're doing the right thing. That's what we want to do. Oh, they're also murdering children. Damn, So I think there's an opportunity, and I don't think it takes a lot on the GM's part to weave that, because in this book, I think there's probably only 4 or maybe 5 real factions, but they all have that deep aspect where at some point in the book you go, oh, I see. Well, that's sad. And I can get why they're doing that, or think there's something that emergent factionalization and making sure that the factions are 3-dimensional enough that there's pros and cons to the faction, and they're not just, hand-wringing, mustache-twirling evil people as a faction, and then angelic, wonderful people in another faction. So I guess that's what I would say about the faction. What was the other question?
That's the main one. How the party interacts with factions is what we're going for.
Yeah, and I think the one thing I would say as well, if you're going to have competing factions, right, where you might set player against player, I do think from a metagaming standpoint, that's an excellent session 0 thing to be responsible for. Because some people do not want that. They don't want that. Some people love it. And then if the person who loves it starts stabbing the person who really hates it, somebody's going to be unhappy with however that gets resolved. And so I think in session 0, you should be clear. If you're playing Paranoia, for instance, you prepare people in session 0 that you're going to be killing each other in all likelihood by the time this is 10 minutes in. But if you're playing a D&D game, people might be like, no, we're the party. The party never turns on itself. I think it's just important to meta that and have that be in the session 0 part of the game if you're going to run competing factions.
I'd agree that if you're going to have competing factions, and the party should have in the session 0 a discussion of like, we're not going to split on this, right? Or if we are, we're all going to eventually arrive at a decision that we all want to support one faction or support a group of factions that in this one thing. That's the main thing that I was going to talk about, is that I like factions.
Before you do that, can I just respectfully disagree? I think it's tremendously exciting if you have people in competing factions in the same game. They just need to understand that that's happening and be okay with it as a storytelling aspect.
I'm not saying that is how it has to happen, but if it is, you have to find out if that is what people want, right? Do they want that to be the conflict, or do they always want the conflict to be outside of the party? I was just going to say that I like the idea of different factions. I haven't used them as much as I should, and I will say that as Sean put it, lecture. I found it illuminating, and I was like, yeah, I think that does work. It does really work. I do think that for players to show impact on the world, I also think it's a great way for the game master to present options to players in a very organic way, instead of having to come up to them and saying, well, you could do this or you could do this. which feels very paternalistic and sort of railroady. Whereas if there's already a group of people doing that over there and a group of people doing that over there, you're at least defining some choices, and they can either decide to take one of your choices or they can pick a third road. That way, the factions are a great way to have that happen. In my current game, I have more urban law-based group, and I have a very rural, more chaos, less rule-based group. And I presented them both to my current campaign, and they ignored them both. But they're still there, and they're involved in big things that are happening. And now the characters are getting to like 9th or 10th level. They're starting to take notice that these players are bigger players. And thanks to you guys talking about this, I'm definitely going to have them push a little harder back on the players.
The other thing that we were going to kind of talk about, I believe, was in addition to faction things, which is one thing, but also that intra-party conflict bit, the potential for having people sort of on opposite sides, but not necessarily outside of the same plot line. And we had discussed this, and Sean, this is for you. I'm going to give a specific example. I ran a game that was my 20th anniversary game for a D&D game that became a Mutants and Masterminds game because it was a long story about the development of a world that eventually landed in the superhero era. I won't go into further details because it's convoluted. But for the 20th year that we had been playing that game, I had a big crossover event, a Crisis on Infinite Earths sort of thing. And what I did is I brought a bunch of players that had played in the game before, but sort of as a guest basis, or we had moved locations and they weren't playing anymore or whatever, all physically together to be the alternate universe team of the same group of characters. And if I have any example of a game that fed off of and benefited from the idea of conflict without opposition, if that makes sense, it was that, because everybody was on the same team from the like fighting the collapse of the multiverse level, but they were also from different universes and different attitudes about the things that they wanted and the things that they thought were important. And that kind of thing, that intra-party conflict that we were talking about, that is not the same, I don't think, as faction play. That's a thing that we all need to do when we have access to complexities of play groups, which is relatively rare and I'm not sure is super commonly applicable, but I think is an interesting story.
I mean, just getting a group to stay together for enough years, getting a party together, getting a game together, then getting them to stay so that they have lore, and then also having other groups that are part of that lore, and then getting all of those people together to talk. Yes, amazing. But
like West March's games are a big deal right now, right? Like everybody loves West March's games and they play it in whatever system that they feel like to play, Shadow Dark or D&D or whatever. And that's the kind of game that allows for that, because there are player characters bopping in and out of play because somebody maybe comes once a month, but somebody comes weekly and right? And so you have group lore and you have group stories, and then at some point you can have that sort of intra-party conflict, the kind of thing where Rachel and Whisk don't necessarily what's his name, Sean? Wick don't agree at this hyper important aspect of the game. Like if we assume that's a game and Borne is the center of play, which I know we're going to talk about that, about whether Borne is a player character or not, but if that is the center thing, that's kind of what the question of intra-party conflict is about, right? Not are they going to punch each other, that Alex was talking about, but how do they go about like having different attitudes about the core center of play. And because of the nature of West March's games being open tables, generally that's the meaning of the play, right? Is that people come in and out. You can actually build that thing where you end up with groups that are not groups, if that makes any sense.
No, that makes sense.
Sean's been really quiet.
Yeah.
I'm trying to be respectful. It's a new thing for me. I'm really having trouble with it.
All right. So before we really get into talking about mechanics, let's just review the book for the folks at home. This is Borne by Jeff VanderMeer. In this book, Rachel is our main point of view character, and she is in a climate-ruined city Borne is a strange creature she finds and raises against the wishes of her companion Wick. The city is rife with factions, monsters, and trauma. The book's vignettes show each of these in turn against a backdrop of an insanely fantastic post-apocalyptic ecology. As Borne grows in power, he threatens not only the balance of power in the city, but also Rachel and Wick's very survival. Borne, the book, is full of morally tangled relationships, ruined pasts and futures, and an exploration of what is humanity. It is the first book technically in a series. There is a second book called Dead Astronauts, and there is also a short story which is called The Strange Bird. So if you do end up reading this book and you liked it, there's more for you to read. So gentlemen, given that, what themes have I not covered that we haven't already covered?
Well, I think one of the things is you talk about the ruined city, but I think the whole backdrop of climate change refugee and it being an I think someone used the term eco survival for it. It's like the main character grew up on an island, which then disappeared because of climate change, and then was constantly a refugee for the rest of her life from that point forward. And having a view from the point of view of an climate change refugee, I thought was an interesting theme of the book. And it paints almost everything about how she looks at the world. So that was sort of cool. The other theme I thought was the parenting story. The fact that this is a story about someone who finds something as salvage, but then figures out, and a constant theme throughout the book is Borne a person or something else? And that exploration is also, I think, a pivotal theme of the story, and an interesting theme that you could weave into a campaign if it was sufficiently long form. Like if you lasted.
Are gnomes people?
Yeah, exactly.
Spoiler, they're not.
Well, Ian, were there any other themes that we missed that you want to bring in?
One of the things I find super interesting about it from a post-apocalyptic perspective, because I love that genre, right, is that we get a name for characters, but we don't get a name for any of the things that are world level, which is super interesting. You have a city that is unnamed, and you have the company, but is otherwise unnamed. But you know that there is a character called the magician, and you know there is a character called Mord, the giant flying bear, and you know, of course, our viewpoint character, Rachel, and so on and so forth. And I think that from a world building perspective, there is something to be said for this idea that we have this apocalyptic world, and we know that it is dying because of climate change, but also there's definitely a problem from the bioengineering perspective, right? Because the centrality of the company and the bioengineered tools that people use and whatnot. And I think that's an interesting juxtaposition, that we talk about characters and we give them names, and we talk about the world and we give it more vague feels. And for me personally, that fits right in with the way that I write and the way that I run games. I think that characters are more interesting than worlds, and I think that it's totally okay to do Star Wars level world building, which by that I mean shallow, cool, but shallow, and then dive into the value of characters and their motivations and the things that matter to them in a moment to moment. That applies to both players and NPCs, because players, of course, need to know what their characters' motivations are and decide on those things and modify those things as play progresses. But GMs also need to know who the NPCs are, what they want in the context of this world, and that's how you respond to play. And I think that, if nothing else, Borne the book is a really great example of someone coming up with a strong but shallow world building design and then letting loose on it some pretty deep characters, both PC and NPC.
Sean?
The things I took from it in terms of overriding themes is this idea that they're in a survival situation, and it sort of defines their humanity, which I'll use in a general rather than related to any one specific species. And Wick, on one hand, is sort of held out early on as Rachel's protector, but he's also a drug dealer. He's tied into a lot of the horrors that are going on here. He knows that the magician is out gunning for her, but doesn't say anything. Borne seems like, oh my God, he ate those people, and that's horrible. But those people there generally were bad, and he protects those around him and makes significant choices based on that. It sort of leads to this question of who acted in the most moral way possible. We want to say, oh, well, Mort is just a bad creature, but he was created this way at some level, and he's a creature who's probably, based on what we find out towards the end, although that is pretty loose in terms of level of detail, he's probably in a fair bit of pain, or maybe even just being a tool filling out its mission. Like, is he evil? And what is evil? What is humanity? And what are the lengths people will do to survive? Is, I think, a constant theme in the book.
Alec, you had more to add?
Well,
It's Alex. Of course he does.
Of course I do, exactly. The other thing that's interesting is the fact that the hidden nature, a theme, is that you don't know what you think you know. The author did an amazing job, and actually a clearly intentional job, like for instance, with not naming the city, not naming the company, but having names for the characters, as Sean was pointing to, I think. I think the fact that the narrators are unreliable and that you slowly peel the onion away, that's also an interesting theme, and I think one that we can take that kind of thing in a group storytelling situation, like a campaign or a run, takes a little bit of finesse on the part of the GM to work with the players to actually have that work and have people remember enough details between runs and that kind of thing to actually make that work.
Do you think you can actually run a game with an unreliable narrator? I'm not sure you can.
Oh, you definitely can. You definitely can.
Give me an example of how you do that.
I have a game where a character was running a cleric. He's still running that cleric. And he, in the beginning, the church presented a particular story that was a creation story, and that was the story of who the god was. And he was operating with that story. And over time, and he got to the point where he was high enough level, he could ask his god questions. He could literally directly ask questions of the god. And he slowly figured out that the stories he had been told about that god were not true. They were literally not true. And he slowly discovered that, almost left his clericness because of that discovery, and then slowly made his peace with it, and then spent literally years of player time figuring out who his god was really and what the histories were, and then learned that most of those histories weren't true, and slowly got a new appreciation of it, and now has a much looser coupling with his god. They're more like buddies than they are a priest and god, but that was the place where it really worked. I have tried it in other places less. That was like my most successful thing with that. It takes a little bit of prep on the GM's part, because you have to know the story to make it consistent enough for that to work. You really need to know the story, and then you need to know what you're presenting to the player and to do it. But you really can do it, and it can be very interesting. It's just a little bit of storytelling work and world building that you need to prepare to really make it work. I've also failed at it where I tried to do that, and then I painted myself into a storytelling corner where I had like one faction. I thought, oh, this will be clever. These will really be good guys. But then they did so many horrible things early on. I was like, there's no way these guys are good people. They just can't be. And I painted myself in some storytelling corners. So it's tricky, but it can be fun. And if you prepare enough, you can really create something. And it creates the experience for the players, I think, of a world that's much deeper than it actually is, if you do it right. Because they get the feeling that there's a whole world out there, and they're just peeling away, what they see and hear to get at the real world of it, which is sort of my experience reading Borne. Was sort of, there was one way everything was presented, and then slowly you peeled away and said, oh my God, that's not it at all, right? So I think it's possible to do that in a campaign, but given the weird interactive nature of role-playing games, tabletop role-playing games, I think it's very difficult.
I think what you described is largely more of a setting secret than an unreliable narrator? The reason I asked that question, and this, I know this is a tangent, and we should move on for time purposes, but when you said that, it just sort of struck me that the GM is kind of the information processing unit for the players, right? And I was trying to figure out a way that you could do that has an unreliable narrator, right? The person telling the players what is happening, can that be unreliable? I don't feel like you can do that. You can have setting secrets and you can lie to them about those setting secrets, but I don't know that you can actually have an unreliable narrator in an RPG because the GM is responsible for telling the players how big the room is or who that guy at the throne is or blah da 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 da, right? You know what I mean? That's all I was talking about. And again, it's probably off topic and probably we should move on. But that's what I was
suggesting moving on. I know you were suggesting moving on, but I do want to say that example in that cleric, for instance, where he started to discover a problem was with the spell detect evil. Because he found that he was detecting evil and another cleric in the party was detecting evil, and they weren't detecting evil on the same people. So the spell, detect evil, was unreliable. They started to relate to it as unreliable because the nature of who was telling them it was evil. But at the beginning, they were relating to it like, no, I cast detect evil. He's evil. We kill him, right? And then later it started to become, wait a minute, who's evil? Okay, Heimdall's saying.
Yeah, but nothing you've said there, Alex, is unreliable. You didn't say you both detect these people are evil and then snicker to yourself and later on say, oh, well, your god was doing something different. Like, I can't believe this. I have to agree with Ian. If you say to the group, like, it's a 10-foot long room, 20 feet wide, there's windows there, and the first person walks in and says, okay, well, you're now drowning in the water of the pool. You didn't say there was a pool. I'm an unreliable narrator. Like, it doesn't work then. Like, at least at a basic sensory level, descriptions of things, which is what I think of as being the narrator. If you're not honest with the players, they have no way of knowing that that's something different until you mess with them.
There's no agency there. But again, secrets are okay. Lies are even okay as long as they're within the context.
I love that everything you know is wrong moment. Like when the player found out, he had a book and he was trying to figure out who wrote it. And then through some weird timey-wimey stuff, he wrote it. Like, I pulled that in, and he loved that moment, and I was unreliable.
I just got chills. I love it.
I was unreliable. I told him that he didn't recognize the old elf who brought him the book. And then later on, through timey-wimey stuff, he's like, you look in a mirror, and suddenly you recognize the old elf who brought you the book. That's different, though, than being like, yeah, you definitely saw it. It was a half-orc. It was you the whole time, but I'm not a half-orc. I'm unreliable, baby.
Well, okay, I want to throw out one concept. And yes, we are continuing on this tangent. I'm going to go all the way to the end on this. So what would happen and this will lead us to our mechanics question, because I don't think any of us picked a game masterless system. But what if you had a game masterless system where all of the players are participating equally? Do you then have unreliable narrators?
Why, as a matter of fact, I did pick as my game A Quiet Year, which is a cooperative game.
There we go.
Without a GM, where people sort of collaboratively put together the what's going on and build the story that way. It's an interesting point, can it be unreliable? I suppose that somebody said in one round, this happened, and later on another round said, well, it didn't happen. But I think that seems unlikely.
Yeah, so. I agree in that situation for sure. But Sean, since we've gone that way already, why don't you continue and talk to us about the mechanics that you would use to evoke Borne, since you've already mentioned your mechanics?
The Quiet Year it's played with a deck of cards. Each card corresponds to a week in the year. Each card triggers some sort of event. Sometimes they're good, sometimes they're omens, sometimes there's delays, change in luck. And you all know at the end of all this, the bad guy, the Frost Shepherds, will arrive, ending the game, and you've got this time to sort of try to build up against this oncoming enemy. So it's not an exact layover match to what's going on here, but it did strike me that a lot of the scenes here felt like they flipped over a card. Like, oh, and now there's a magician in the town. and she's gunning for you, and then suddenly she has a rocket launcher that she has, and she's attacking the big bad bear type thing. It's just sort of a lot of that, and I think that the quiet year concept of putting together cards and building it in this world, particularly given, as Ian correctly points out, how open this is. Like, if you sort of all agreed, like, whatever we're doing here is tied into this world, and by the end of it, something has to happen. Something's going to happen this year, and we can sort of move towards that. I did think about Gamma World. That's an obvious choice for this sort of thing, but I thought this type of game, this type of story would work really well in a collective type fashion.
All right. Okay. Alex, do you want to tell us what your mechanics do you think would be best for evoking this?
Sure. Although I love Sean's, like both of those are good. I did think that Monty Cook's games Numenera would be really good because Numenera has that sort of weirdness and post-apocalyptic. You find stuff, but you really don't know what it is. Some of the stuff you find is really cool, and some of it's biotech, and some of it's electrotech, and some of it's weird magic, and it's just there's a whole feel to Numenera that I thought would be a really easy to weave Borne's story into a Numenera universe, and the rules would allow for it very easily. So that was one of them. And Mothership, because it's sort of sci-fi horror, and it has this whole dread and survival in this sort of a really unforgiving world. So I thought that would also work well to create that feeling of you're fighting for your survival all the time. It's always dangerous. You have to trap your house. It's that sense of constant impending doom and fighting, scratching out survival against all these alien and encroaching horrors, right? So those were the two systems I thought would be very good for this.
As we all know, there are a ton of post-apocalyptic games that could fit this. Everything from Gamma World, as mentioned, through Numenera, through Twilight 2000 or whatever. The one I decided on as thinking about this is relatively recent. It's called Ashes Without Number. It is a Kevin Crawford game. It is a signed nominee game. And anybody familiar with Kevin Crawford and his company, what he does really well is he creates games that encapsulate the genre. And now his mechanics tend to be what we call OSR-ish. In other words, they have sort of a foundation in old D&D and then expand upon those things. But what he really does really well is that he gives these tools to sort of build the world as you play. There's a lot of discovery and a lot of using random charts and things, but they're not incoherent. They're very coherent, right? And so in the end, you've built this very, very interesting, random, yet coherent world. Now, I understand that VanderMeer is a great author and he's really smart, and this world is not random, but it feels that way from an RPG perspective, right? The evil children, for example, feel like something rolled up on a random encounter chart, then was given importance throughout the rest of the story. That's what signed nominee games look like. And Ashes Without Number, in particular, is the post-apocalyptic one. And the other benefit that it has, by the way, is that it allows normal people as player characters, where a lot of post-apocalyptic games don't. Everybody's a mutant, or even the normal people aren't just normal people. They are special, super normal people. So I kind of like the fact that Ashes Without Number has just like random, you could just be normal people. Yeah, and which of course leads to the question of whether or not Borne, the character, is a PC. And I'm on Borne as an NPC, and the only PCs in this story are Rachel and her boyfriend sometimes, but others may disagree.
I would definitely disagree. I think the Borne character is really interesting, although if you're going to have Borne as a character, the one time that I've played Kids on Bikes, and I've been told since that this is not how it normally works. I played with Colleen, and she had everyone take a turn to play the main character. Like if it were E.T., it's just everybody gets to play the alien. If it's Stranger Things, everybody gets to play Seven for like a certain period, whereas everyone else is you also have a satellite character who's doing things. I think it could work in a kids on bikes sort of situation in that regard. But I do agree with you, Ian, that you can't have a completely amorphic, basically superpowered character and everyone else is a normal person and have a very satisfying role-playing experience unless everyone gets a chance to sort of experience being
But
the superpowered
that's not
monster.
why I don't think he's
So.
a player character, right? Because Buffy came out 20 years ago, solved that problem by like with its meta currency, blah blah, right? Like it did a good job of it. Like you can solve that problem mechanically. The reason I don't think Borne is a PC is that Borne's existence, what Borne does is Borne drives action by the two characters I listed as PCs. So that in an RPG, to me, makes him an NPC because his choices and the weird stuff he does and following Rachel in the city and then she has to watch out for him and she's not paying attention as much as she should, blah, blah, blah. That's why I think Borne is an NPC, not because he is more powerful than the human characters, but because his stuff feeds directly into the stuff that the people I think are PCs do.
I would argue there is a way of looking at that he is the PC. Certainly more than the magician is, and maybe even, more than Wick is. He comes in and he's developing and he's learning, and at various points he does things that Rachel and Wick have real conversations in part because he imitates them and goes back and forth pretending to be the other one. He has a journal that sort of has his thoughts and how he's really struggling not to eat them, even though at one point he surrounds Rachel as a rock and it would be very easy for him to digest her. And at no point did either Rachel or Wick say, oh, by the way, maybe you should take care of Mord the giant bear. He just kind of decides that's what he's going to do. It's one of the themes of identity here is who are these people and who do they want to be?
Alex?
I'm
you seem to
definitely
have a
in
comment?
camp PC, Borne as PC. I enjoy the challenge myself of running non-human characters, and I push my races in that direction in my long-term fantasy campaigns. Like my elves are hive-minded insect-like creatures, and my orcs don't have their creations, their artifacts. When I have players run them, I set them up to try and think like that, as much as that's feasible and pleasant to play, right? Which sometimes it might not be. So I think it's a fascinating challenge, but some people don't want to do that. And so I think the question of Borne being a PC is depends. If it was me running Borne, I think I would love running Borne and enjoy the challenge. Other people would want to be one of the more humanish people like running Rachel or even Wick. And I think it depends on the player more than almost anything else, whether or not a creature that's not human can be run by a player if you intend them to be run as non-human, because that can be challenging. And sometimes you can't do the things you want to do with a character if you're trying to hold to some kind of, this is how these alien creatures act or something like that.
Yeah, I think if you gave the character sheets out and you said, all right, well, Borne is curious, he's adaptable, and he's kind of innocent about the world and wants to learn about it. He wants to, protect Rachel, and you had the same sort of, 3 words for Rachel and 3 words for Wick. I think that would be interesting. I mean, I think if somebody's, you said to Wick, like, well, you're kind of manipulative. You need this medicine, and if you don't have it, you'll die. But you can't tell people that because in this world, that's how people end up dead. So you've got to maneuver things your way. And so you're smart, but you're also a little guilt-ridden. It would take good players to make Borne a PC. But, I think it could happen.
I think that from another direction, and I know I've done this before because I remember Ian saying, oh, you can use Fate Core for anything. A lot of this book is about the social, almost combat that takes place between Rachel and Wick, and then eventually between Rachel and Borne, and they have to negotiate. And I think doing that from a game standpoint between these 3 player characters, or between the NPC and the player character for Ian. I would think that the Fate Core, it's got a series of roles that you can provoke people emotionally, and then you can either use empathy or deception in order to determine how they react to. You can obviously see how Rachel is more skilled in the empathy section, although sometimes she shuts down and can't do that. And Wick is much more in the deceive in order to get people to do the things that they want. So I just wanted to throw in my mechanic for the Fate Core in there as well. But on the flavor side, I think a reflavoring of the role-playing game Trophy, specifically Trophy Gold, which is where you travel down dark road. It's a travel through a deep and dark fantasy forest and almost everybody dies. That has, I think if you reflavored that into the post-apocalyptic biowarfare landscape where everybody dies, you could use a lot of the mechanics and a lot of the background that's in that to make your game work as well. Just
I
as
am not
another
familiar
option.
with Trophy. Who makes that?
I'm not even sure they're still even making it. I mean, that maybe I'm sure it's out there somewhere, but
They have a website
Okay.
and you can buy stuff from it. Published by The Gauntlet and Hedge Maze Press, and it was designed by Jesse
Interesting.
Ross. Worth checking out. Seemed like a really cool thing. Again, I haven't played it before, but I read through parts of the system and I was like, I got the feeling a lot of the time that I was walking through a dangerous place, almost like a deep and spooky wood, and horrible things kept coming out and doing things. And that's the entire basis of that role-playing game. So I felt like it fit the Borne model pretty well. We've actually spent a decent amount of time talking about things that we would like to take away from Borne and put into our games. We've talked a lot about the themes and how those themes are there, but are there any more direct, let's say, more concrete items from the story that you'd like to bring into your role-playing games? Sean, I think you said something about
so in the back of my book, the author has kindly put in a bestiary and describes the creatures and has the page number you can go to find out. So things that are mentioned quickly in passing, he provides 2 or 3 paragraphs on that gives you a little bit more information on it, and suddenly some of them pass by so quickly you don't even notice them, but when you see them sort of a bestiary out there, you get a sense of like, oh wait, this is a real thing that I could add on some stats and use in a game.
Almost clear that Jeff VanderMeer is a gamer and wanted to give us like, oh yeah, that creature, here's the flavor text.
Or at the very least,
stat block.
he spent some time doing some discovery, right? And he's like, that's not going to waste.
One of the things I liked about that aspect of the book, which I think is very good for world building. Some GMs are not as crazy as I am, but I like to know who's in which niche. What's the apex predator? What are the things that eat? What are the scavengers? What are the flying scavengers? What are the land scavengers? But having that as background text, I'll roll random encounters sometimes, and then I'll roll the intensity of the encounter. 00 could be Mord, the flying bear. I might roll a 02 on percentile dice, right? And then that would be, you see in the distance a fox dart between 2 buildings. And that kind of flavor text, I think, adds a lot. So if you know what that background, what the city is, right, in terms of what are the most common things you might see walking down the street, it gives you that ability to flavor text the city into existence without you having to talk a lot and like narrate a lot. You can just say, have a random encounter where they see in the distance a particular thing or either an object or a building or an animal or a creature. Or see Mord way off in the distance. Every now and then, every half an hour, you see Mord flying around somewhere or crashing into a building way off in the distance or something like that.
I am definitely team horrible, murderous, child, cyborg, bio monsters, right? Yeah, those are going in every game.
Absolutely. They are terrifying.
They're so horrible. And I stopped reading and did a little clap when they got completely murdered by Mord proxies, who are they're not good things, right? Like, it wasn't like the good guys one. It just was like, oh, those children are dead. That's great.
Alex, I know you had more things you wanted to talk about, so can you jump back in?
I think having sources of antagonists is nice. For instance, the company, there were like different, like 3 or 4 or antagonists, or maybe only 2 or 3, but 2 or 3 antagonists that came from this one source, which is almost like having a thematic source. And then there were climate change, sort of eco sources, though, but they're all tied together, right? The company clearly helped with the eco disaster, but the magician, was connected to the company. And then having multiple sources for antagonists, I think, is a fun thing I would take away. The other thing is, I am really fond, I really liked Borne. At first, I was like, are you serious? A flying giant bear? Seriously? And
Flying
I know,
giant
it's
bear.
like, you're great. That's so stupid. And at the end, I was like, that's what an awesome character, right? It's just an awesome thing. And so having something that sounds so crazy, and anyone listening to this, if you're thinking, I'm going to read a book about with a giant flying bear, and I want you to know something, you will appreciate more by the time you finish the book.
I will throw in my pitch at the end of that to say that anytime you can make a giant corporation the enemy, I am in. I will always play that game. I will always run that game. I find corporations a continuous font of evil that feed almost every single one of my games, even if I don't live in a very corporate, even if I put my characters in a not very corporate sort of world. The idea of this faceless and sometimes mindless driving force that people are supporting feels, I mean, it feels cult-like, but in a evil, greedy sort of way, and so it fulfills all the things. So whenever you've got an evil corporation in charge of something, I'm always going to be there. You guys covered a lot of the really good stuff, the bestiary and all the fun things that are there. I also especially like all of the ecological dangers that were out there, that you can't drink the water, and that the rain, I think, is dangerous, and you're walking by a plant and that plant will kill you, and
The rain with the
idea that
salamanders, where it rains
Oh,
the
yeah.
salamanders, stuff like that. Just great stuff.
Just crazy, insane stuff. Those kind of ecological and world weather effects like that's really makes for a fantastic game world. But media. Yes, we know that Jeff VanderMeer has presence, he has a style, and he's written a bunch of other books, so please read everything by Jeff VanderMeer. But if you wanted to find inspiration along the lines of Borne, where would we go and find that? Ian, did you want to start?
Now, I'm a big fan of weird post-apocalyptic fiction, and the weirdest post-apocalyptic fiction came out in the 80s with a lot of movies, and they're not good, but they're great. And the one that I'm going to tell everybody to watch, especially you youngins who have discovered podcasts recently, should absolutely watch Hell Comes to Frogtown, which is an epic of epic proportions that stars one former wrestler and a bunch of people in frog costumes. And I'm being flipped, but seriously, the weirdness of the genre, especially as expressed in that era, when a lot of it was complete garbage, right? It was responses to Conan movies and Mad Max, and they mixed those things, and it just got weirder and weirder and weirder. But one of the beautiful things about Borne is it is intentionally and beautifully weird, right? Stuff happens that makes very little sense, but at the same time feels very real. And if you find the examples in that era where people were experimenting with that post-apocalyptic genre, Hell Comes to Frogtown is a funny movie, blah, blah, blah. But you have Wizards by Ralph Bashki, great movie. You have Six String Samurai, which is a strange movie that's about music in the post-apocalypse. But if you watch it and pay attention, the weirdness actually has meaning to it. That's what I think that people that really like Borne should sort of dig into. There's an era in the 80s when post-apocalyptic media, particularly movies, but there were books and stuff too, that embraced the weirdness but still wanted to say something. And I think Borne does that. And Borne does it differently in the sense that it is talking about climate change and it's talking about bioweapons and biotech. And in the 80s, it was all about nuclear war. But that idea that the world has been ruined and the world is weird now, but there is still something to seek out. There are relationships that we should have. I think you can find a lot of that reflected in that era.
Yeah, like Night of the Comet, which is again not nuclear, but definitely that's in that.
That's
group,
a
don't you think?
zombie movie, technically.
Well, actually, that's a zombie. Fine. There we go. Fine. All right. Fine. Alec, get me out of this trap and tell us about some
So
of the
there's a
media that
couple
you're
things.
interested in.
One of the films I like is the Girl with All the Gifts, which has this theme of protecting this girl that is young but dangerous and has weird powers, and you don't really know what's going on, and there's a whole biotech infection and a lot of moral dilemma.
Great book, by the way. Excellent book.
And I love
Yeah.
District 9, which is it's South African movie about this alien shit hanging over a city, and this guy that starts actually turning into an alien and dealing with this change in who he is and what he's about, and it's about a corporation as the enemy. So you would really like it, Eric, right?
Yep, absolutely. Bad guy
And
corporations.
So that's really good on that side. And I think on the book side, I really thought Annihilation is a good counterpoint to this. It's a very different book than this, right? But one book I thought would be really good counterpoint. This is Ridley Walker, which is a book by Russell Hoban, and it's about post-apocalyptic scavenging and this altered language and a fragmented history and sort of a weird. The Wind-Up Girl, I don't know if you've read that. You guys have read that by Paolo, I can't say his last name, Bacigalupi, and which is this like weird biotech dystopia with corporations controlling everything and biotechnically engineered species, and it's all about survival. And also, however, has the same aspect of Borne as really being about the characters and not about the world.
And Wind-Up Girl is one of the earlier eco-apocalypse sci-fi novels. It came about early in the state where people were starting to realize that maybe nuclear bombs were not our biggest problem.
Sean,
I wasn't
what do you
as
got for us?
focused on the end of the worldy type stuff. I thought that the weirdness of it, Tales from the Loop, would be a more solid connection. If you like the feel of not entirely knowing what's going on around you, but you want a gentler, kinder way than Black Mirror, Tales from the Loop would be the way I would go. If you really like the idea of sort of people surviving in a horrible situation, I thought the later parts of BPRD, where they're dealing with the end of the world, fit that mode. It went on longer than it needed to, but you do have a situation of large, horrible creatures floating around and not knowing what to do with them, alliances shifting from here to there, old plots rising back up towards the end of the thing. So those are what I would recommend if you like that spirit.
Agreed. Anything with the BPRD and Hellboy and that whole group is always awesome. When I looked at this, my first reaction was very China Melville or Mieville, Peridot Street Station. I think that has the weirdness factor, but probably cranked up way more. VanderMeer is a bit more realistic, and Melville is just turn that knob way up there. The one that I really like that I want to recommend is by Megan Lindholm, which is a pseudonym for Robin Hobb. They wrote a book called Wizard of Pigeons. It's an urban fantasy with a completely unreliable narrator. So if you like the idea of not knowing what's going on and not really understanding how the world works until the very end, like this book does a lot of, the Wizard of Pigeons is basically a guy who is a wizard, or is he a wizard, or is he a homeless guy? And he's in, I think, San Francisco. I didn't double check that before we started, but he's in San Francisco, and people are trying to help him, but he's also trying to save the world kind of from monsters. But is he really, or is he just a crazy guy that's a great book, and that's a mind-bending book that I think is fantastic.
I agree. It's brilliant.
Well, it's one of the books that I read and was like, there's before I read Wizards of Pigeons and then after that. And then the last thing I'm going to recommend is the first non-fiction book I've ever recommended on the show, which is I would recommend Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Kolbert. She is the person who wrote The Sixth Extinction, and she is a scientist, and that is her book on climate change and where the planet is heading. So if you are interested in any of the real things that are going to happen, in climate change and this whole climate survival and where we're going to end up is of interest to you after this, I would recommend Under a White Sky by Elizabeth Kolbert.
And it's good for you to read nonfiction.
Nonfiction can be very enjoyable. At some point, we're going to have to do a Game Masters book club where we read a nonfiction book. It should happen. I don't know what we would pick or when, but it will happen.
Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare, #1. Do that. No, I'm not kidding. That one.
Maybe we'll discuss that as our next book for this group. It could be fun. But does anyone have any other media for this book that we haven't covered that maybe we didn't get to?
Did have really one thought. There's a movie called Children of Men, which is a post-apocalyptic thing where kids aren't being born, and it doesn't have the same thematics to it exactly, but the feel of the movie is, I think, very similar to the feel that Borne has. And so I was thinking of that as we were talking about media.
Wow, we made it. Wait, that's the end. Right. So now it's time to talk about things that you guys want to promote, because we've talked all about the book and now it's time to talk a little bit more about you guys. I'm going to save Ian for last because I know he has exciting things to say. And we're going to start with Sean.
Exciting things to say. Wow, that's
Go ahead,
the worst
Sean.
ever. All right, now we'll take a pause. You can cut this part out too.
Okay, cut this all out. Okay, Sean, do you want to lead us off?
Yeah, so I'm guessing that by the time this comes out, we'll be looking towards the beginning of 2026, and I think everybody on this, I don't know about you, Eric, but I think everybody else on here is going to be at TotalCon. If you're there, our games will be up. You should sign up and come and make fun of what Ian does and try to be an unreliable character.
Just a note, TotalCon will be in Massachusetts, February 19th through the 22nd, 2026. I will definitely talk to the guys at TotalCon and see if I can't get as many of our GMs as possible, since I think most of them will be at TotalCon. We'll get as many people as we can to TotalCon and have a giant Game Masters Book Club panel.
We should do the panel. We should do it live. I want to do it with Sean live. We should make that happen.
Absolutely.
No,
that should happen.
Jump on Sean's recommendation and just, looking forward to seeing people at TotalCon, testing out a bunch of new stuff. Please come join us. And in preparation for 2 months later, we'll be doing Rising Phoenix Gaming Con. So come and join us at TotalCon.
Excellent. Ian, promos for you. Go ahead.
I have been very lucky recently that now that I have finished getting my civil engineering degree, I am doing some freelance work again. And this year I have done some work for a setting called 9 Worlds. It is a Savage World setting, but it is also a 5e setting and will soon be a campaign frame for Daggerheart, which is exciting. And I will be running that at Carnage. In addition, and I can say this here, everybody is sworn to silence, but by the time this goes out, it'll be available. Everybody will know. I am working on the 5e conversion of Deadlands that is coming from Sigil Entertainment this year. By the time this gets out, not only will it be announced, but the Kickstarter will probably already be either on or soon, right? So, but I am super excited to be back doing work for the industry and making games great for people that are not just the people that I can get at my table.
That's fantastic news. Congratulations. Yay!
Indeed. That's great.
Thank you.
And that's our discussion of Borne by Jeff VanderMeer. Thanks again to our sci-fi savants, Sean Murphy, Alex Jackl, and Ian Eller. You guys are the best. Look for them to return when the Game Masters Book Club covers Scales of Justice by Maggie O'Marsh, a Roderick Allen mystery. You can find a complete transcript of today's discussion, as well as links to all of our podcasts at k-squareproductions.com/GMBC. You can learn about upcoming episodes on our social media on Blue Sky at gmbookclub.bluesky.social, on Facebook at Game Masters Book Club, on Mastodon at Game Masters Book Club, and on Instagram at Game Masters Book Club. If you've enjoyed the show, please like, subscribe, and comment on our episodes in your chosen podcasting space, and be sure to share those episodes with your gaming community. You've been listening to the Game Masters Book Club, brought to you by me, Eric Jackson, and K-Square Productions. Thank you so much for listening. Later, gamers, and to paraphrase the great Terry Pratchett, always try to be the place where the falling angel meets the rising ape.